Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. If you love knitting, quilting, and all things fiber, you have to check out the new Fiber and Fabric Craft Festival. It's brought to you by the team behind H&H America's premier craft trade shows across the U.S. They have something for everyone, from consumers to retailers to manufacturers. Come shop, learn, and get inspired. Learn more at fiberfabriccraft.com. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. Gudrun Johnston is a knitwear designer whose work appears as the Shetland Trader. Gudrun, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you are back in Massachusetts, right?
Yes.
But not too long ago, you were in Shetland, and your design name, your business name is the Shetland Trader. Can you tell me a little bit about that connection?
Yes, I can. The Shetland Trader was the business name that my mum used when she ran a knitwear business in Shetland in the kind of early 1970s. She had a sort of ready to order knitwear business. So people would fill out a brochure and order knitwear, and she had local knitters make it up. And then there would be a sort of time period of, 6 to 8 weeks, which always kind of blows my mind, intricate all over Fair Isle sweaters and things like that. And I believe my parents were trying to think of a business name, and were at the pier in Lerwick in Shetland, and there was a boat called the Shetland Trader. And they thought, oh, that sounds like a good name. So they used that. My mum had that business for maybe 4 or 5 years, something like that. And I was very, very young at the time, sort of a baby and toddler. And then she sold the business, and, that was that. And it wasn't until I started to get into knitwear designing. So the very first thing that I had published was with knitty.com. And I think that would have been around 2007. And Amy Singer, who owns knitty.com, mentioned to me, oh, this design is coming out. Do you have a knitting blog? And I didn't at the time. And she's like, well, you should probably have one because people will come looking for you. And I was like, okay. So when I was thinking of what do I call this knitting blog, that was the point at which I started to use the Shetland Trader name. So I called that blog the Shetland Trader. And then, it's just kind of stayed with me this whole time, and feels very appropriate by this stage, almost 20 years later since that first design came out.
Right. So there is kind of knitting in your family history, but not necessarily hand knitting. It's not necessarily that this is a hand knit business passed from mother to daughter.
No. And my mum was not a knitter. So she didn't even teach me to knit at a later stage or anything. As I mentioned, I was very young when she ran this business, so I don't have a memory of her doing it. My parents left Shetland not long after that, so I mostly grew up in mainland Scotland. And it wasn't until, well, again, sort of coincidentally, when I was first getting into designing my own knitwear, my parents returned to Shetland, retired back there at the same time. And so I was starting to visit them a lot and spend time there and connecting to the knitting traditions there. They bought a croft that they renovated in the same bay that we had lived in when my mum did run this knitwear business. And it's also the home of the Jamieson's mill. So that particular location is called Sandnes, and that is where Jamieson's yarn is made. So that's the only mill that's on Shetland. So in my early visits back there, I went to the mill, and there used to be a shop attached to the mill. There is no longer. but I could just go there and get yarn. And so from sort of those early days of designing my own knitwear, I was drawn to reconnecting with what my mum had done. And I actually had some of those pieces of knitwear which were designed for children, things that I had worn and my siblings had worn and had been passed on to me, and my kids had worn them. And so some of the early days of me knitting and designing, I tried to recreate some of those sweaters for my own kids. So yeah, it was that connection kind of was fortuitous that they returned to Shetland at that time, and I was able to make that connection again.
So it's sort of that in a way this was all ready for you to step into, but you found your way back to it on your own.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it wasn't a career choice that I was like laying out a business plan for or anything like that. I had learned to knit, as I did learn to knit probably around the age of 9 or 10. And I was taught by a school teacher. We lived on a different island on the west coast of Scotland at that point. So I do remember knitting then and making a vest, I think. But then I didn't do it really after that, and got back into it as an adult when my children were very young. Actually, here in Massachusetts is where I kind of reconnected with knitting, which is also kind of part of this full circle, story, because we have come and gone from Massachusetts several times. We keep ending up back here, but we've bopped around, gone back to Scotland and gone to other parts of the States too. So yes, that trading aspect, that Shetland Trader name, ties into all of that for me, because it has taken me lots of different places, and I now get to share a lot of that with the knitting community, which I love.
One of the things that is very interesting to me about Shetland is that as an American who grew up on the East Coast, but not particularly near islands, Shetland seems to me to be very far away. But in a seafaring culture, being a Shetland trader and having goods and ships and ideas from various places come through was just sort of part of the ethos.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's important to remind people of that when we're talking about the heritage and the traditions, because there are obviously specific things that Shetlanders developed when it came to knitwear specifically. But those things also were instigated and influenced from elsewhere, because there was so much trading going on, trading of different kinds of textiles. We don't know the exact origin of the Fair Isle, the story, like where that came from. Yes, it became this specific thing on the island of Fair Isle, but the influences would have come from other places because of that strong trading and travel and sharing. Yeah.
And for a fairly small geographical place, I think that's fair to say, right? I mean, Shetland is not super large. There are quite a few distinct knitting traditions. There's haps are a signature of, I think probably they were used for a long time, and maybe they've only become really popular among current knitters more recently. But lace is famous, color work is famous. So there's a lot of different knitting ideas and practices that are happening in a fairly small area.
Yeah, and what's also fascinating to me on all these different trips where I have returned, and different times that I've spent longer periods of time, like most recently spending 3 months there with my husband, I actually had the opportunity to interview myself, a bunch of Shetlanders. And there's such variety even within Shetland of ways of doing things. And that is fascinating to me. There's definitely assumptions made that everybody in Shetland uses a knitting belt, but there were parts of Shetland where they didn't. And just different aspects, like different ways of cutting that you're knitting and things like that too. So it's incredibly diverse within this small geographic region too, which is always really interesting to hear about.
And as somebody who came to it as a knitter, not necessarily passed hand to hand, you have the opportunity to interpret and choose and incorporate those in your own style. So when you look at design work, how do you think about these? I should say, Do you think of yourself as a Shetland designer in that sort of knitting vernacular that happens there?
Unsure, like entirely how to label myself in that regard. Like I definitely feel like I come from Shetland at this point, but that has been, really over these last 20 years, because I don't really remember being a kid there. It's my dad's side of the family that was from there originally. So my great grandparents are from there. So I definitely have the heritage there. And I think because of the further connection through this craft, I feel like it's in my blood, like it does feel very much a part of me in that way. And Shetland does feel like a home, even though I haven't, lived there really since I was 5. But in terms of being a Shetland knitter, no, I think there's a lot of traditional things perhaps that, I have come to from the perspective of an outsider, or because most of my knitting has happened here in the States. I mean, like the fact that I don't use a knitting belt. I never learned on a knitting belt. I do own one and I bring it to classes to show people. But the tools that I learned on, because I was here and was exposed to circular needles and whatever. So like, that's what I use. But I would say in terms of product, like I've used Shetland wool since the beginning of my time knitting. And I do feel like I understand that product in a particular way. But I'm learning things all the time. Like I said, just every time I have a conversation with a Shetlander, I'm like, oh, I didn't know that people did it that way or whatever. So, and that I suppose is just to say that, there are different approaches. There isn't just an exact one way of doing things. And I guess I believe too that these heritage traditions, they have to also be living traditions. There's the respect for what was done at certain periods. But if you look at Fair Isle, it's gone through different fashions and different ways of doing things, putting colors together. Like a lot of that can be a personal taste as well. And those are aspects that I think about when I'm including anything that is a traditional pattern or technique or something like that in a design. I'm not necessarily always just trying to recreate something that's already existed.
Sure. But at the same time, the HAPS work that you've done in terms of incorporating the traditional sort of feather and fan motif and the color work, thinking of the identity cowl that you did for our first print edition of Farm and Fiber Knits, there are those kind of unmistakable Shetland elements to it that's sort of I'm going to use the word accent in a metaphorical way. Do you know what I mean? That there's a certain inflection, that you have a Shetland inflection, even when you're interpreting it in a broader way.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Definitely. And I think, it's always an influence on me. I mean, the majority, I would say, of the things that I design are including some aspects of those traditional things, like whether it's a traditional motif and certainly, yes, sometimes I might use an actual Fair Isle motif or lace, stitch pattern that's well known there. And then other times I might, start with that, but then kind of ad lib a bit and things like that. I mean, I definitely think it's important to honor those, to honor things that do make something specifically Shetland lace or Fair Isle, and for people to understand what that means in a Shetland context. That is, really important. But I think when you think about construction and things like that too, it's been fun to sort of blend those aspects and take perhaps, less traditional constructions, for instance, as a starting point. But I would think most of my design work is heavily influenced, by Shetland, whether it's the traditions or the colors in the landscape, the wearability of the garment and things like that. Yeah.
Yes. And, I want to go back to yarn, because I think there is such a special quality of Shetland yarn. There's a distinct quality to the sheep. There's a distinct quality to the processing. There's a distinct quality to the color and blending. And Do you mostly use Shetland yarn in your work?
Yeah, again, primarily that is what I've used. I've certainly used other yarns and, over the years of designing, and depending on what the design is, whether I have collaborated with a particular yarn company or something. But yeah, I mean, that's my desert island yarn, for sure. Like that's my comfort zone. And, and I've worn it since I was a baby too. So like it's never been an itch factor or whatever, a roughness factor for me.
Right.
And like I mentioned before, I also have these heritage pieces, that my mum had made, and those have been in my life, for a long time. And yeah, so the durability aspect has always been an impressive, thing to me, as long as you keep it away from the moths. But
yes.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing. And now my kids are adults, and they have such a deep appreciation for these textiles too, and are constantly trying to thieve from me my knitwear stash, and like, hey, are you using this? I'm like, oh yeah, maybe.
It's pretty cool to be so close to a mill, to kind of see the working of it and have that not just as a special destination, but as something that can be part of your daily life.
Yeah, absolutely. And the mill really has always been kind of open doors in that regard of like, yeah, you can just pop in, and it's a small community there. In more recent years, my older brother has moved back to Shetland, and he became the school teacher in that town. So, he's teaching some of the kids who are part of the Jamesons family. Like, we've known them for a long time. And yeah, it's an active community, although it's small, with a town hall or whatever that, things happen in. And so, yeah, it's pretty easy to pop into the mill. Maybe less so now than it used to be for strangers, because they are busy. And but you could, used to be able to just kind of go in and be like, oh, sure, just wander around and,
around the heavy machinery with the big teeth.
Yeah. So, now with, safety procedures or whatever, they do organized tours, but yeah, it is a very welcoming place, and but busy. Yeah, certainly with a lot of noisy machinery going on too. Yeah.
We love to hear about busy yarn mills. It makes me very happy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They could be going 24 hours, like they do a lot of finished knitwear as well there. So they're producing yarn for that too. And they have several, high-end knitting machines that are making finished garments too. That's a big part of what they do. Yeah.
Are there still cottage knitters who are hand knitting, or is it more that that's something people do for their personal use these days?
Yeah, not very much in the way of smaller hand produced. A little bit. Some knitters will still, who, maybe had businesses back in the 70s, 80s. A lot of these smaller businesses stopped operating around the time the oil terminal was built in Shetland. People could get paid a lot more money to go clean the toilets in the oil terminal than running a knitwear business. So there was definitely a dip at that point. But with events like Wool Week that happens every year, and I think that's been going for like 15 plus years at this point. I forget now, a long time, but that has really helped kind of to energize the knitting industry and the traditions. And there certainly is there are a lot of yarn producers. The two main ones I would say are Jamesons, and then Jameson and Smith, which is a separate company, and they send their fleece away to be processed in Yorkshire, I think, and then it comes back as a finished product. They're the two main ones, but there are a lot of smaller, producers happening, and more of those in recent years too. So, perhaps there is a bit of a return to at least that aspect, but not so much in terms of like finished knitwear for sale quite the same way. Smaller items, hats and gloves and things like that will get sold at some of the textile museum and things like that. But yeah, there used to be one or two shops you could go to in Lerwick that had items for sale. and they are no longer, there.
It just sounds so expensive. Not that making your own is inexpensive, but you do get the sense of satisfaction of having made it yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the knitting scene like there? When you go back to visit, are there other knitters the way that I have a knitting group here in Colorado?
Well, there's a very active guild of knitters, spinners, weavers, and dyers. Like that is a guild that's very active. And yeah, I mean, there are, communities, I would say, that meet up for knit nights and things like that. I mean, to remember that for a lot of the older generation in Shetland, knitting was something that they had to do at certain points. And so for some of them, there's maybe still a slight aspect of returning to it being something, that's just done kind of for pleasure. But that's an older generation that's perhaps not, as active in it now. And then with Wool Week, too, there's obviously a lot of events that happen around that particular period, which is always the end of September. So lots of exhibitions and classes. And I think since the start of that particular event, that also has helped, I think, encourage Shetlanders to embrace it. Shetland knitters are very modest too about their knitting skills, and they don't show off about it and stuff, but I think, they have grown to kind of realize how much it does need education around it. And actually, most recently, I think just before the end of last year, this organization called the Shetland Organization of Knitters began, a nonprofit organization specifically for the purpose of protecting that knowledge and being a resource for people outside of Shetland, but also for people within Shetland that might be looking to expand skills or, be part of something. But yeah, there are definitely knitting groups, and it's definitely a very active thing.
That is a challenging, people use the word fair isle. I remember we considered a book once that was, I won't name it, but it used fair isle to mean, I don't think it was any color work, but any stranded color work. And I objected. And I was told that really, that was, nobody else was going to care about that. But when something is popular, there's the name fair isle gets used, the motifs get used away from out of scale. And so that kind of interpretation maybe invites people to say, this is, we're going to set the standard. This is the real thing.
Yes, absolutely. And it wasn't intentional, but the organization kind of, was just getting started at the point at which this game show came out in the UK. And their first episode was all about, making a fair isle. And their whole language around it was wrong and ultimately insulting to the traditions and what makes something fair isle. If they just said it was a stranded knitting focus or whatever, that would have been fine. But that was good in a way because it did create this conversation, and this particular organization was able to start giving that information and saying, well, this is why we're here and why we're protecting things. And this is what makes something fair isle, and so that people can understand the differences, and when to use the term.
And it seems like part of your work as a designer and an author is inviting people to come along and see what you see. So you were recently an author of Grand Shetland Adventure, where people got to come and, see the Shetland landscape and knitting in that context. So having it be a little bit more than just a name, but being able to see the spirit of it.
Yeah, and that book I co-authored with Mary Jane Mucklestone, and we ran trips to Shetland prior to the publication of that book. And we called our trips Grand Shetland Adventures. I think we maybe had 14 or 15 different groups altogether. So this book kind of came out of that. It was photographed in the area that we would bring the groups to and stay in. Obviously, when we had these groups, we would take them different places. So we were sharing a few travel kind of stories or essays in that book too, just describing places that we like to go when we're in Shetland, places that are special to us. And I think combined with obviously the patterns, but the photography, of seeing the landscape, people are really moved by it. They, even if they haven't been there, but we would find that on the trips, would get people coming and they would just be absolutely blown away and would often return multiple times after being there. Like it's a journey to get there as well. For sure. It is a remote part. And yeah, it's pretty special arriving in that landscape. And I love to share that with people who are fans and who follow me on various social media things, like that. Again, that feels like part of what I am as somebody who isn't, as I said, living in Shetland. But I'm very connected to it, and I spend a lot of time there. Again, it's just being able to share, some of that, with people who may not ever get, over there.
And you're in the process of working on another book that will be photographed there as well.
Yes, that's right. I'm busy with that right now. Everything is due at the end of March, so I'm very much in sort of pattern writing, test knitting mode, all that kind of stuff. Yes, so that book will come out in September on time for Wool Week, and it's Shetland focused again. Kind of got a theme of color running through it. It's also vest focused, so all of the garments are vests. That just sort of developed as I was working on it and realizing that it was an item of clothing that I was wearing a lot, and decided, let's just hone in on this and just make it vests, but with different ways of using color. So there are some traditional stranded and fair isle vests in there, but then there's also color blocking or marling and different gauges, but all using the Jamieson's 2-ply, which they call spindrift, or their DK weight.
Is that the jumper weight?
The jumper weight is the 2-ply. So the jumper weight is what Jamieson's call spindrift.
Okay.
And then they do a DK, which is a 3-ply, so it's slightly thicker. And it comes in, 225 colors. So,
wow.
So there's a lot. Yeah. There's a lot to choose from. And certainly I've gotten into color work and more traditional fair isle stuff, I would say in the last maybe 3 to 5 years or something like that I've, focused more on that. And I feel more confident, now in picking colors and things. But it's still something that a lot of people struggle with. So in the book, I'm hoping to be able to share just sort of at least my process for doing it, but also give people opportunities to play with color in other ways that maybe they're more comfortable with trying out first. And talking a lot about the yarn itself, so the properties of Shetland wool, that will be part of the book, and hopefully showing some of the process inside the mill too. So yeah.
One of the things I have noticed about your work recently, though, and maybe it's just that I've, fallen in love with some of these garter stitch pieces and some of them that turn different corners that are kind of contemporary, and I would say maybe more about simple knitting texture and about the yarn itself, as opposed to complicated stitch patterns and stranded color work. Do you think that's a trend, or is it something that you're sort of playing with?
I don't know if it's a trend. If it's a trend,
is it a trend for you?
I'm not...
Is it a trend for you? I guess I should say.
Yeah. I mean, it has become that, I think, with this particular sort of garter stitch focus, which actually kind of began with a garment that was in Grand Shetland Adventure Knits that I called the Riggies cardigan. And Riggies is a Shetland term for garter stitch. So those garter stitch rows are called Riggies. And I kind of went for, a little bit of an unusual construction with that. But it was, like you say, tied into the yarn, as well, like the way the loftiness of the Shetland wool and how it blooms a lot too. So like the fact that you can knit it, on a larger needle size, and it doesn't have this loose looking fabric, and particularly in garter stitch, it can be really beautiful, and then if you're using a heathered shade as well, it can have all this depth of color and, simple texture to it. And then I went on to kind of play with some other ideas in terms of that cardigan, then there became a Riggy's beanie, and it was the way it got pieced together. And now, more recently, I did this Riggy's vest, which also uses a similar construction in terms of short rows and things like that. And there's the opportunity with all of these to color block, because things are knit in pieces. They're joined with 3 needle bind offs as well. So there's an opportunity to just have a little bit of color, like in the 3 needle bind off. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I just, got into some kind of groove with that and have done several Riggy's things. And I think there's more to come.
So one of the things that I notice about Shetland knitting and spinning is that there is a whole vocabulary that is not always easy to tell from the outside what it means. So there's Peary patterns and Riggy's, and it's Makkin. I don't know how you pronounce that.
Mackin. Yeah.
Is that
knitting?
In knitting.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the names of the sheep are just very broad. Tell me about this whole other language.
Well, the Shetland dialect is very different from the rest of, mainland Scotland. It's very Norse influenced. And a long time ago, it was Norn language is what was spoken. And there's definitely, a strong movement to protect that and have it not just be a dialect, but, if somebody's speaking to you, fully in Shetlandic, then, it's quite hard to understand, along with it, because they are quite soft spoken as well. And a lot of Shetlanders will, they call it, I think, knapping, where if they're speaking to somebody that they know is from away, then they will deliberately be trying to speak more English words or whatever.
What we would call code switching, maybe.
Yes, there you go. There's, most of the place names in Shetland are Norse-derived names. It was part of Norway and Denmark for a long, long time before it became part of Scotland. And it is so far away from mainland Scotland that Shetlanders think of themselves first as Shetlanders rather than being Scottish or saying that they're from Scotland. They would say they are from Shetland. So that Norse influence is still very, very strong in Shetland. Yeah. But yes, it makes for lots of fun names.
And there is a kinship also with those others. There's a kinship in some ways with Faroe and Iceland.
Oh, definitely.
All of those
yes.
island with the dual-coated sheep and strong knitting traditions and colorwork traditions.
Well, and again, because of the fishing, and sea, trading. Yes, absolutely. Very strong connections with those other places, more so than mainland Scotland. Yeah.
So when you look at the work that your mother, created, obviously you're a different knitter and designer with your own tastes, but do you notice that styles and things have changed since the 70s? I feel like the 70s is not that long ago. It's my lifespan, but it is at this point, 50 years. So that's not a short period of time, but
I think it's still very relevant. And certainly a lot of the sort of silhouettes that she was creating, or having, knitters create, because no patterns were written for those. It was kind of like she would come up with, I want this turtleneck sweater with balloon sleeves and ferrule here, lace here, that kind of thing. And she was doing something a little different in the context of what was happening with ferrule knitting at that period in Shetland. There had been a bit of a shift away from those traditional motifs, and what was popular kind of in the 60s, latter part of the 60s, were the more Norwegian style yoke sweaters, so bigger star patterns and things like that, which would have come from Norway, and brighter colors and things like that. So there'd been a bit of a shift away from using some of the more natural looking shades and some of those traditional motifs that you would find in ferrule knitting, which are made up of different sizes of patterns. So you have your Peary patterns and you have your border patterns and larger patterns, and they're broken up usually horizontally. But so she was she was inspired by seeing an old sweater that was in the museum, which did use natural dyes, madder and indigo and things like that. And so she had, I think, probably one of the first pieces that she had recreated actually as a child sweater. And it was children that she designed for initially. And initially she was really just having things made for us. And friends saw, and they're like, oh, can you get your knitter to make some of that for us too? And then it became the adult garments after that. And yes, you can definitely see that fashion aspect of the 70s coming in. And certainly when I think of my mum, at least in terms of photos in that, period of her life, like she was not from Shetland. She was English. My dad had met her and like convinced her, that they should move to this far, far away place. And she was definitely very cosmopolitan and kind of, into her fashion and clothing and stuff like that, very stylish. And so yes, seeing the influence of other textiles and things like that, which clearly were, informing some of her choices with what she was deciding to have made, which included dresses, floor-length skirts with Fair Isle on them, anything that was plain knitting, any sort of plain one-color stockinette, that would have been done on a knitting machine. So a lot of Shetlanders at that point who were being paid to knit items would have a small, home knitting machine in their house. So those sections would have been done on a knitting machine, but then anything that was Fair Isle lace, they would do by hand. And they were certainly bringing their own expertise and creativity, into it. There's a designer, which is called the Shetland designer, Wilma Malcolmson. And she said to me once that, she thinks every Shetland knitter essentially is a designer, because they are, they generally aren't following patterns. They're not like looking on Ravelry and going, well, I want to knit that thing and I want to use those colors, like they know how to make a sweater, and they're picking their own colors, they're putting things together. So there's a lot of design process that happens there. And that was true of the people who knit for my mum. A few years ago, I did a collection of knitwear that was based on stuff that my mum had designed. So I had, again, over the years of being back in Shetland, I had acquired more and more pieces that people had bought, back in the 70s, or friends of theirs had bought and still had them and gave them to me and things like that. And so at a certain point, I was like, oh, I really need to do something with these, like, because patterns weren't written for them. And it certainly felt to me like, I feel like these are things that people would want to knit and wear now too. And so, yeah, and I that collection certainly still continues to sell and be of interest. People are like the big balloon sleeves and the turtleneck. So yeah, I do think that it's still of appeal. I mean, I know that there's phases of returning, the retro sort of aspect of wanting to return to clothing that your parents wore, and things like that. But yeah, I think it has like stood the test of time in that regard. Yeah.
When I think about a lot of my sort of idea in my head of what Shetland knitting is, this is going to be really insipid, but I have to say, it all is very hard. Do you think, is there plain knitting that goes on? I mean, I know that some haps are large garter stitch sections with just lace on the border, but it seems like folks are not cutting corners here.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that there was definitely a generation of Shetlanders who weren't, again, because of that oil influence, who weren't exposed to knitting perhaps the same way, and have maybe come to it later in life. And it certainly is very active within the school age community. It used to be taught in schools. There used to be a knitting teacher until relatively recently, but the council made cuts or whatever, so that doesn't happen anymore. But there are groups that have formed for after school clubs and things like that. And yes, they are being exposed to fair isle knitting and things like that, but there's certainly plenty of plain knitting that goes on, or that people are interested in doing. But there's also just a skill set there with a lot of Shetland knitters that is, again, just kind of like part of who they are. And they don't maybe even fully recognize how skilled it is. I mean, they do, but they're modest about that. Yes, they'd be like pulling things out. They're like, oh, this little thing that I made, and it's, this right. intricate lace work, on cobweb yarn or whatever. Yeah. And I think, with Fair Isle, and I think this is also true of a lot of Shetland knitters, that they tend to favor one over the other, so they might dip in a little bit to some lace or whatever, but it's not that they do all of it. Mm-hmm. Hazel Tyndall, another expert Fair Isle knitter, she loves doing Fair Isle, but she hasn't done that much lace. And a few years ago, I don't know that she'd ever made a hap. I'm not sure. I feel like maybe she hadn't, or maybe she'd made one a long time ago. So she knit up, a hap and documented that. And so, yeah, you can kind of think, well, she's got this incredible ability to put colors together and do this amazing Fair Isle work, which again, she's just kind of putting together what she has. And, Shetland knitters are very thrifty as well. Like, they are resourceful, and they'll use up, they'll often have a lot of different colors to choose from because they've kept things. And so much Fair Isle, you sometimes use a very small amount of one color and things like that. But yeah, I have noticed that when you speak to Shetland knitters, they tend to do either more color work or more, lace knitting.
And I did speak to Hazel last year, and I think that she mentioned that she's teaching young people to knit as well. So that's sort of...
Yeah. A lot of people in her generation are generously, giving their time after school or lunchtime clubs or whatever to keep that going, to keep passing on that tradition, because the interest is there. And that's definitely really encouraging to hear. And there used to be a textile degree program that they did at the Shetland College as well. And although it didn't really do a lot of hand knitting, it was more focused on finished knitwear. That was always really interesting to see that intersection of, taking some of these traditional aspects and influences, but bringing them into a more contemporary fashion sort of era. Yeah.
As we're saying this, I'm saying, my goodness, people knit such complicated things. And I'm forgetting that your mom was part of a much longer tradition, which is Shetland knitting, excellent Shetland knitting as a economic driver, and that people started knitting these incredible, intricate, beautiful things because other people would pay for them. That this Shetland knitting is this long tradition of something that is economically prized.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I would say it's got this history of being a source of supplemental income, but not necessarily always prized in terms of paying for what it really was worth. So, just talking about haps, those were pieces of outerwear that women made and wore themselves, instead of a jacket. And when lace knitting became popularized, it was Queen Victoria, I think, was sent a piece of lace knitting from Shetland and made it all fashionable. And so suddenly there was a demand for export. So then they're making all of these things to export. But during that time, there was a pretty unfair system in place called the truck system in Shetland. So often knitters were sort of trading the knitwear with the laird, the landowner, so the landowner would be taking it from them, and they might not actually even get cash for it. It might be that they can get something from his store, but perhaps not particularly useful items sometimes. So it was certainly, it needed to be done, and yes,
Right.
it was a source, it was a source of some amount of extra income, but often a struggle, and not as you would imagine, seeing some of these incredible, especially the lace pieces and the fine lace pieces, what they really should have been valued at, for the time and skill, put into them.
Yeah, that's very true. You mentioned earlier something about the wearability of these items. And are you mainly thinking about hats and jumpers, or how does Shetland knitting fit into people's lives?
Yeah, I suppose certainly garments. Shawls are actually one of the things that they don't have. I think the earliest piece they have of a lace item is from 1836, but like those everyday hats that were worn, because they were worn, they haven't necessarily survived, so they don't have examples of those the same way. But a lot of those lace pieces certainly get put away and protected and not necessarily worn. But the Fair Isle sweaters, the jumpers, they were made, and hats, and there's other gloves and things like that too. Their purpose was to be worn outside in the elements, and because of those properties of the Shetland wool and the sheep that have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years and have adapted to that climate, you get these amazing properties with the wool itself. So you have that strength, in the yarn itself, but the lightness and the waterproof aspect and the self-cleaning aspect, and just, all of this. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe they just don't really have very many moths in Shetland. Things last.
Yes, maybe. I envy them.
But yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly. I have pieces, as I said, of my mum's, which are, over 50 years old at this point, and they're in great shape. Yeah.
When I think about wearability, vests certainly are, checking that box. Not only can you get a garment without having to knit the sleeves, which always feels like the interminable part, but they're good for all kinds of different. You can wear them in warm weather or cold weather, and so I'm finding a lot of vests are so appealing to knit and wear lately.
Yeah, they do have a good versatility and like layering ability, too. And they can be kind of both things. They can be adding to the warmth of your core, or they can be worn, with just a t-shirt underneath or whatever. And because the Shetland wool in particular is this lightweight quality, you don't feel just immediately hot in it,
Right.
Yeah, just self-regulating.
And so you are going back to do another photo shoot with it?
Yes, I am going the end of April. I just booked my flights. I actually have a couple of friends who are going to join me for this photo shoot, which will be really fun. They haven't ever been, I don't think they've even been to Scotland before. So it'll be a big adventure for them. And they are knitting some of the vests in the book, but showing them in different palettes and things like that, which again is always really helpful for the knitter to see. And the other thing that I have personally been getting into this past year is sewing. I had really kind of distanced myself from it for a long, long time because I just thought that me and sewing machines were not compatible. Like this machine and cutting fabric, and it all just felt too daunting and final. But I got over that and have really, really, gone for it with the sewing. So I want to include some of that in terms of the photo shoot for the book. Just not offering any sewing expertise particularly, but more just sort of that making and outfit sort of creation, just the fact that, well, it is possible to really think about the knits going with these sewn things and at least let people know what the patterns are. So there'll be mention of what patterns, were used for some of the sewing things, and including ones that will be, more accessible for anybody who is, like me, was like, I want to do this, but it seems really hard, and like just encouraging people to go for it. Yeah. And these two friends that are coming with me, they have been, very kind of formative for me, in terms of this sewing journey, and very, very, supportive and helpful. And it's just been a really, because obviously knitting for me is a profession, now, to have something in that making realm that isn't that has been really refreshing, and also just like a reminder of what it's like to be a beginner at things, and a reminder of like, oh yeah, it's really helpful when somebody shows you a tutorial for how to do this thing, and that's informed, or sort of reinvigorated for me, like how I'm thinking about the instructional part of sharing patterns and how helpful it can be, and seeing things in different materials or different palettes, how much.
I think there's an approach that people who are successful at making their clothes take that is also like what you said about Shetland knitters, is there's a certain confidence in knowing what changes will have what effects, and knowing what suits you and what you prefer. I would love to make my own clothes, but I am not confident in adjusting patterns. And it seems like in sewing, that is a hurdle that you have to be willing to get over much sooner than in knitting.
Okay.
Do you find that?
I don't know, because I think, like, I wasn't really aware of, I don't know what the standards of pattern writing have been for sewing patterns. Like, I don't really know the trajectory of that the way that I do for knitting patterns. Certainly I felt like when I got into designing, for the first time, it was, again, I feel pretty lucky because it was the advent of Ravelry and just a lot of knitting blogs. There was a lot more talk about like how you could do these things yourself, and the ability to write, if you want to write a lot of instructions or have a long PDF, like it's a digital format. So, but I don't know what that's like in terms of the history of sewing patterns. And I definitely just decided to go for it with everything. Like, I just decided, because my main motivation was I wanted to make jeans. Like, I was like, I see people making these amazing pairs of pants, and like, that's what I want to make. So I quite quickly got there. I was just like, I'm just going to do it, and, but yes, there was a community obviously already there, and an overlap with the knitting community for sure. So I felt like there was a lot of resources, in a different way than when I got into knitting, which was still gradually building up in terms of the online, or video tutorial presence. So it's kind of felt like anytime I've had any kind of issue or whatever, somebody's quickly there to sort of say, oh, try this trick and do this. And I did find with most of the patterns that I was exposed to in this past year that they did seem like they were well written, in the sense that they did offer information on adjusting, and especially in terms of pants, and like, and I knew that I would have to do that, because typically when I'm buying jeans, ready to wear, whatever, I tend to find that, like in the torso area, and I like a high-rise jean, but sometimes they're like far too high-rise for me. So I was like, I know I'm going to have to like take out stuff there and learn to do adjustments and stuff like that. So I just kind of did it. I'm just like, oh, well, we'll see if this works. And some of the pairs of pants that I made early on, it's like it doesn't work brilliantly the first time, and then you have to just adjust it, fine tune it for the next pair. And thankfully, like a few of the pairs that I've made, I gave away, a pair that fit a friend better than me. And one of my kids, weirdly, although they are much taller than I am, they're 6'2" or 3" or something like that, and I'm not. We have the same like waist, so they have, they've taken on some of the pairs of pants that I'm like, those ones are not for me, but I learned so much just by the doing, and it, although it's a very involved process, it's so much faster than knitting, like it's, yeah. And once I made sure that I had like a dedicated space for it as well, like, so it's set up. So it means, I can do stages of it. I can cut out the pieces and then I can come back, and it felt harder when I was like bringing everything out each time. But yeah, it's been so much fun to do. And I'm excited, to kind of bring a little bit of that into this book. Yeah.
I think I just need somebody to help me figure out how I need to adjust these patterns, because boy, slash and spread looks pretty intimidating if you've never done it before, which is for anybody who doesn't sew, it's taking the pattern piece and literally cutting it into pieces and manipulating them and drawing a new piece and cutting it out. And it does not.
Yes.
But one of my colleagues actually at this point hand sews most of her wardrobe.
Wow.
She started a few years ago.
That's impressive. But yeah.
Well, when you, as you say, when you knit for, when part of what you do for work is knitting and spinning, the desire to have some other textile pursuit. Mm-hmm. I actually wanted to follow up on something you said earlier. You said something about what you're supposed to be doing. And I'm curious, until you designed this piece for Knitty, presumably you were not thinking that you were going to have a long career as a knitwear designer. How did you decide that this is what you were supposed to be doing?
Well, it wasn't an overnight decision. It was, as I mentioned, I, had not knit for a long, long time, and hadn't done it since I was a pretty young child. And when we moved to Massachusetts from Scotland, our daughter had a blanket that somebody else had made for her, I think when she was born, and I'm pretty sure it was crocheted, very multicolored, but she loved it. I mean, she was very, very attached to this. And we lost it during our move. And I walked past Northampton Wools here in Northampton, Massachusetts. And they had this poncho in the window. And I was kind of like, maybe I could make something for Maya, and went in there, bought the yarn, bought the pattern. And I do remember the person who helped me asking like, did I know how to pick up stitches, and was I going to be all good? And I was like, didn't have a clue what she was talking about, and I think maybe the first knitting book I got was The Idiot's Guide to Knitting. Like, it could have been,
which was a fairly good book. I think that was that Pam Allen's book? No, she did Knitting for Dummies. She did Knitting for Dummies.
Yeah,
but they had great people writing some of those books.
Yeah, well, it helped. And my daughter still has that poncho. She is turning 27 this year, and she did bring it to me kind of in pieces recently, and my first seaming job had eventually come apart, so that's pretty good.
That's very good.
But then I just very quickly went down that rabbit hole of knitting, and I think also this area I was certainly meeting a lot of people who were doing things with fiber, whether they were spinning or whatever. So it was other young mothers and whatever that were doing that. And so, just kind of very quickly got absorbed by this being a hobby and a craft and stuff. And then, as I said, my parents moved back to Shetland, and, it was kind of then that I started to go off-piste with knitting patterns and going, maybe I could like figure this out and make my own thing. And I don't know, honestly, what made me decide I was going to submit something to Knitty, but we were living in Colorado. Actually, at the time, we were living in Colorado Springs that year. My husband was teaching at Colorado College, and I had made up this skirt, which was in hempathy yarn for my daughter. And I was aware, I was just starting to become aware of knitting blogs and things like that. And certainly was definitely very much aware of the magazines at the time, and, would get those and everything. And just saw the, submission information on Knitty and just figured, let's try this. You'll see what happens. And they offered a lot of support too. Like, I had never written a pattern before. I hadn't graded a pattern or anything like that. I just made it in one size, for a specific purpose. So that was also very helpful, just to kind of have that hand holding. early on to kind of start to understand some of how this goes. Yeah. And then I had my knitting blog and started to have, the interactions and communication and just kind of gradually added things in from there. But yeah, it was a slow process in terms of going, oh, I could actually do this full time. I mean, I wasn't on a different career trajectory or anything at that point. We were homeschooling our kids at that time as well. So that was my job. And this was something I could kind of do alongside that. And and then, start to bring in things like the teaching side of things and getting invited to do that. And so it was a gradual build up of going, oh yeah, actually, I guess this is my job now, and this is pretty fun. And yeah.
It's funny. In some ways, I had such a parallel, different, but parallel kind of a trajectory in that I started knitting around that, early 2000s when I was working in a New York publishing house that incidentally was my next desk mater was very excited about, I think it was one of the first books she acquired, and she loved it to death. And it was Gabriel's Story by your husband.
What?
Yes. Debbie Cowell was my colleague. And my boss at that job.
Wait, have you told me this before?
Maybe once, but only in passing.
Wow.
So my boss at that job taught me how to knit. And I fell hard down the rabbit hole and sort of gradually did editing of more knitting books, because even though I had thought I was going to be a big fiction editor, nonfiction is what makes sense to me, and knitting is what I was obsessed with. And so I went on to edit a couple of knitting books, and one thing and another wound up in Colorado at Interweave editing knitting books. So and 25 years later, here we are.
That's amazing.
So, yeah.
Oh,
so
wow.
It is very interesting to have been doing knitting for as a profession, kind of getting into it sideways, but for this period of time where well,
that's very cool.
Gudrun, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. It's just been really fun.
And I, look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.